Good evening. Welcome to the latest episode of On the Hot Seat, a live talk show that happens online only when it happens. I'm joking. Of course, it happens when we think that there are some issues, pressing issues that we wanted to share.
Happens online only when it happens.
Okay, I'm so sorry about that. Yep. So it's some pressing issues that we wanted to talk, or some pressing newsmaker that we want to discuss with them and talk to them, or perhaps if you have any questions, you can ask them, since the show is happening real time. Today, what we're going to discuss about is there's a string of events in the past few months. Journalists has been investigated, publications has been banned, news media, in particular some news media organization that has been carrying some report or stories from a foreign media organization has been reprimanded, and interviewees of the news story has been persecuted. So even last week in the parliament, we see that people talking about the licensing requirements perhaps for social media content creator. But again, of course, later the Minister of Communication and Multimedia step out and clear the air and say there's no such thing until law has been made on this, or has been a new law has been legislated in that particular area. So I think this series of events took place in the past few months really set the stage for our discussion tonight, to explore whether the space for freedom of expression in Malaysia is or rights to information, a very important pillar of a healthy democratic society, whether it is being undermined and whether it's being threatened. And of course, to discuss this, we have two scholars today with us joining via Zoom. I would like to introduce them. Okay, first it's Ms. Gayatri Venkiteswaran, Associate Professor from University of Nottingham, Malaysia. Her research focuses on media reform, and she's also on Malaysian Media Council, the pro tem team, right? So she would talk a little bit about what's going on with Malaysia's media reform. And then she was a practicing journalist and have vast experience in press freedom, advocacy, and community development. On the other hand, we have Dr. Chang Peng Kee, a very good friend of Pocket Times, from the School of Media and Communication Studies, University Kebangsaan, Malaysia. He specializes in public relations and media framing. So, yep, welcome you both. Not in the studio, but welcome online to the show.
Yeah.
So I think when we talk about the issues today, or the pressing issues today, we can't escape from starting or to talk about the documentary published or broadcasted by Al Jazeera. I don't know, you both locked up in Malaysia, locked down. I don't know whether you both has watched it, but I have watched it twice. Once because of the issues, because of the controversy. I don't know, but maybe we can start with Dr. Chang. What's your thought on it? And then we move on to Gayatri, and then we can move on to what we will be discussing today. Dr. Chang?
Okay, thank you very much, Li Chin. I think that again that I would like to thank Pocket Time for giving me this opportunity again. And I mean that when the time that I asked to share about my opinion about this documentary, 25 minutes and 50 seconds. And of course, I know this is actually a little bit of controversial, and subsequently there's a lot of issues happen. And I think that we are going to deliberate on that matters. Definitely, I would say as Al Jazeera is actually claimed to be a very fair and balanced report. I can see there is an effort made into having both sides of the story. Somehow or other, I think that the fact is, if you read carefully about what the documentary is trying to highlight, I think that put it aside about this journalism or freedom of expression and so forth, but I think they already make a judgment from the very beginning. So I think that is with the siren sound, and then after that, second, it came to be a military style of operations in the Kuala Lumpur. And I look at it again carefully, and in the first 30 seconds, and with the appearance of the journalist, and then they come up with a statement, and with like this: in the name of the public health and safety, they have rounded up illegal foreign workers. When you look at these rates, you can't help but think, is this the practical reality of dealing with a pandemic, or is it racism? I think that the keyword here is actually because of I put it as quote unquote as accusation of racism. And subsequently, I think that it's actually come up with so much issue. So I think, and I don't deny the fact that it's actually, there are actually actions against the illegal immigrants, regardless they are actually workers or not workers. It's illegal immigrant. But he put it as, again, the judgment is discrimination against the migrants. So it's actually a different thing. If we look through carefully in terms of how that he framed the story. So I think that maybe I would just put it as the beginning for us to start with. And from what that I try to look into how that the journalists and how the media is trying to frame the story. So put it back to you, Li Chin.
Okay, Gayathri, what's your thought on that piece of reportage?
So maybe two things. For me, I think first is that I think for a lot of people, in fact, as we sort of came to this pandemic and the actions taken by the government, it's something that we should discuss anyway critically. The visuals or the optics of the enforcement with regards to the movement control order, you can't deny the fact that there was this level of insecurity. There is a sense of fear, which is understandable during a crisis like this. But you know, the visuals that relate to the operations, the use of barbed wires, for example, these are things that you don't see on a typical day. I think in speak people who have survived through various historical events, in our own history, barbed wires are not something that you come across in a kind of a civil action, or reaction. Barbed wires have been there, in the early days of tackling communism, for example, in this country. The villages, being cordoned off. When we've had big protests, you've had those wires being placed, particularly in certain areas. So the use of those images actually are not necessarily something that you associate with a kind of a civil response or a justifiable response. So I think those images have already been discussed amongst a lot of people in Malaysia, whether you talk about social media or even in the news media. These are things that have already been there.
Which has been discussed actually before the Al Jazeera story, right? You were trying to say
exactly. So I think that we do need to recognize the build-up to the production of this particular documentary film piece, news feature, whatever we call it.
Yes.
Second, I also think that we need to be, in watching that piece, to me, I think it fits in very well with the kinds of stories that Al Jazeera have already been producing in the past. I think it's very consistent. I think there's a certain level of professionalism, although I do have some comments with regards to, and again, I think this is something we wanted to discuss specifically on the way in which we deal with people who are vulnerable generally, right? I think actually, Dr. Chang, you raised a good point about terminologies, and I think this is where actually sometimes terminologies are our problem here in Malaysia, because the use of the language that we see both coming from officials and also the media, in fact, create that level of discrimination and perpetuate certain kinds of stereotypes. And I think that's actually a thing that worries me, because we label people in a certain way. So to me, watching the documentary, I think actually has a very strong context. And if I may just point out, and this is, just to give a context, we've had activists like Irene Fernandez from Tenaga, the late Irene Fernandez, in 1995, coming up with a very important report talking about the state of migrant workers or foreign workers and the problems with detention centers. So this is not a new issue, but the way the government reacted and responded to that issue, 15 years ago, and now there is a certain mentality on, or maybe there's a certain, this is what you say, out of boundaries for the government to deal with. So I think there is a context to the topic itself, the issue itself. I think there is, the second one is, I think, Al Jazeera's reputation in terms of focusing on stories like this actually, to me, I think there's a good reputation there. And I think the context to this issue is that there is a history behind it as well. So I think we need to recognize that.
Yeah. Okay. I think a lot of people, I mean, especially the authorities that have come out to lambast the story itself or to criticize the story itself, and actually also sometimes it's kind of disheartening when you see how the netizens or the discourse online talking about all this, these are illegal immigrants, they are not entitled to certain things and all these things. But I don't know, like, you know, there are a lot of like unhappy voices. What should these people do when they are, you know, when they're given a piece of story like they publish or broadcasted? So what are the recourse they have? Like, you know, for instance, authorities, like, you know, for instance, Shabri, you know, what can he do? What do you think?
Sorry.
Yes.
I think two things. Again, you know, I'm just trying to.
Is it the ad time now?
No.
Gayatri out, is it?
Yeah, I think we dropped. It's.
Oh, okay.
Hi.
Yeah, she's back. Yeah, okay.
That was a line.
Okay. I think it's online.
Yeah. In the middle of sentence, you can continue. Or
No,
Yeah.
we're waiting for you.
Yeah, it's okay. Nama, let you continue. Okay, it's okay.
Thank you.
Yes.
Okay.
So the first thing is, I think, from the perspective of the authorities, and again, this is the reason why I brought up the 1995 report on workers and detention. I think that, you know, instead of using the arm of the law as your first port of call, speak to the media. I mean, I think, you know, I would say kudos to the media for, you know, really, despite the challenges that the pandemic has brought, the media, the journalists, you know, the media community has really tried its level best to put out information timely, as much as possible, to also assist people in making their decisions. I think that, you know, given those challenges, there was a lot of good reports that came out. I think that the government should have really used this opportunity to make itself available. The problem is that the minute you see something or the government sees something it doesn't like, it wants to take action. Instead of saying, what do we then bring in to clarify this information or rebut? I mean, you don't have to clarify, you can rebut. You can say this is actually what the situation is. And, you know, I think without even going through that process and then to say you've done something that is, you know, tarnishing the image, look, I think that is such an old and archaic way of dealing with things. People consume information and access information from all sources. To think that you want to control that source of information is really out of date already. And I think to not recognize that, I think it just demonstrates how insecure the authorities are. They should have used that opportunity to say, okay, we want to stay our peace, and this is what it is. But for the public, I think that, you know, you're right, Niching, that it feels like there was so much of that kind of very negative tone on, and to some point also very xenophobic comments.
Yes.
But, you know, there are many that come from a sense of insecurity, of also, you know, not understanding some of the issues behind why people migrate, why people go to get jobs in different places, the countries that they come from. There's a lot of wrong information that's out there about many of these people, but that gets passed on and shared, and then you know, it's quite, again, disturbing, the level of hatred that we can see online. But I think it's because you don't encounter them, or that you worry so much about something that doesn't exist, the challenge that they're going to take away something from you, which is all actually not even true. Yeah, you want to talk about, you know, there are many people who say, oh, these are sources of crimes. Look, you take the facts that are given from all the authorities and they tell you that's not even the case. So we don't, you know, we're not looking at information, we are looking at the emotions that are being spread around. So this is from the public, from the users. I think really taking a step back and say, what is it that we're really angry about? What is it that we want? And clarifying information. So I would say that the government should have used the space to rebut, by all means, rebut if you want. And I think for the public, I think it's really getting out of this, you know, I'm the victim, I'm under siege. Get out of that and recognize that there's actually a much bigger issue at hand.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, Dr.
And I think you both, I think that were trained as journalists, and I think that I know, Lichin, that you study law, but I think that now you are actually a media person. I'm not. I have never worked as a journalist. My profession is actually public relations, and I still uphold my profession is actually to have a good media relation, especially with the journalists and so forth. And in this case, we make comment. I think I'm not sure. I'm not in that position because I do not know how they work about the government PR in that sense, and dealing with the media in that case, like what Gayatri is actually recommending to have a rebut on the issues and so forth. And subsequently, I think that Lichin also is asking how that the public have a dialogue. I think that with what we call the netizen, that is actually with a more reasonable kind of a comment. But let me put it into this perspective. I think that maybe can play also the role as a devil advocate in that sense. Not saying like we actually make enemy, but it's actually giving a different view. And I think we look at it that it's always look at from our own perspective. As being a journalist, that we may look at it from the journalist perspective and how you think about the organization as like a PR. And in that kind of scenario, in that kind of situation. Okay, and I think that we all know, I mean that during that time is actually this thing happened, I think that in June, because the pandemic, the lockdown is MCO, is actually not what we don't call it as a lockdown, but we call it as a MCO, Movement Control Order. Lesson degree in terms of like so much, not so much military in that sense. Like it's actually, if you talk about that, it's actually more or less like what we call as a darurat. It's actually we cannot simply go out, but I think that we have a lesson degree. So I was trained as a military person. I worked there for 5 years as an aircraft technician, Royal Malaysian Air Force. So we know, I think that we have to ensure, I mean, that the public safety and also the order and so forth. So it's not so much like what we want to do things is actually as we like. So in this case, I'm talking about the government now. I think that when the media is actually reporting something that is not to your favor and you don't like it, and we don't want to take it something is as personal. So let's put ourselves in their shoe as like in the PR in that sense. And of course, we can recommend and certain measure can be taken into to harmonize the situation. Okay, so I think that maybe in that respect, I think that we can comment about their PR approach. One thing about that. So another aspect, if you talk about the netizen nowadays, and sorry to say, I think that we have actually go a little bit beyond our limit. I think we are actually not thinking rationally. Most of the time, that is actually more of emotionally. And I think that also, not saying that I'm not sympathizing the what we call the marginalized community. So-called some that are refugees, some are actually just come here without document, and it's still another word is an illegal immigrant. So to say, so I know that it's actually very much sympathetic. So of course, not up to the extent like we can go and scold them and so forth. I think that we can also see from the documentary, there is one man, Alex, is actually doing something. Is actually out of the humanitarian ground. I think that certain things that we can do and not to the extent like also commit a crime in the sense to help them to encourage more and more. Like I think that we also see a few days back, there is 2 dozen of claim to be Rohingya refugees actually trying to cross the border to Langkawi. So I think we have our law. I think that you have to understand from the enforcer point of view, be them a military person or policeman, they have their duty to do. So I think that I have to say that maybe a little bit different from what that you think about from the what we call the NGO point of view, I would say.
I think
okay, Richie?
Yeah. I think both of you has provided like a different context on how we look at it and how we can actually understand the report. But I would actually like to know, because from a string of events that happened post the broadcast of the stories, of course I meant to say that Astro was being fined for another video. I mean for another report, for another broadcast, and of course we are saying that the interviewee has been persecuted. Gayatri, what would you see that this is? What kind of implication for what has transpired, will there be in future for us when we are reporting or when we are covering stories of marginalized communities or vulnerable people within our communities? What kind of implication do you see? And
I think so. Actually, kind of segues from Dr. Chang's last point. I suppose that actually, the point of the legal framework, the problem that we have in Malaysia is that it's a legal framework that is quite bent on actions, punitive actions, rather than protection. That's actually one of our weaknesses. So, sure, officers take instructions, they are following the codes, but actually the problem starts with the fact that the law itself is, or laws are defined and worded in ways that are actually too arbitrary and too broad, right? So, which means that the interpretation becomes a little too broad. So, for example, we can say, like, if you come to communities who are say coming to Malaysia with or without documentation, I think that's we need to be very careful also about how we define, because if we are part of an international community, we have international standards for a lot of things, human rights, as a person, as a human, there is a human dignity. You're not legal or illegal in that sense, whether you have documents or not. And that is something that is a procedural, technical issue rather than actually the status of the person as a human being, right? So I think, it's easy to say, look, the law is there, we have to enforce the law, but, I suppose that's our job, right? To step back and say, look, is there a problem with the law actually that is then disadvantageous to some people who are actually already in a very disadvantaged position, right?
Yes.
So if a law, to me, a legal framework would be one that allows for protection, and protection is, I think we should, when we talk about the emotions on social media.
Yes.
I think people interpret protection as a special position or going out of the way to give something to someone that they might be entitled to, that's taking away from somebody else. So I think we should understand that the legal framework, I know people don't want to get into the details of this, but a framework that protects allows for a much more judicious and humane way of dealing with things, right?
Yes.
So, to the question of how is this going to then impact marginalized communities or those who are disadvantaged, I would say, and this maybe Liching is it's really direct to the media itself,
Yes.
I suppose for the longest time, one of the challenges and problems with the media is that it continues actually to play on those disadvantages, and rather than pulling people out of that state of disadvantage, I think it we'll have to be honest and say that it sensationalizes that levels of disadvantage. So we speak about whether they should be in this country or not. We speak about people of diverse backgrounds, sexuality, genders, and all of these things. But at the end of the day, for a lot of the media, it's a clickbait. It is something that is the conflict that sells, that gets the attention. But what is the position of the media when it comes to dealing with something like this? So when we see different ways of reporting, so for example, Dr. Chang started off by reading that opening lines in the Al Jazeera report. We are immediately hit because these are terms that actually sometimes we don't use in the Malaysian media because we are so used to putting people in those boxes, right? And then the conflict sells in that sense. And I think we really need to stop that and say, why are people in the position now like that, right? Going beyond that to also explain. It's a tedious process. It takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of context. But that is the investment, and that is what makes the news media stand out from all of the others. Stand out from the social media, stand out from all the other kinds of sources of information, to be able to do that. Right? So I think that the implications will be that it becomes more challenging for someone to speak out because they see that if I'm going to say something about my position, I'm going to get arrested, I'm going to get deported, or I'm going to be in a detention center, or I'm going to be jailed, sedition act, this, that, rather than saying, I'm in a disadvantaged position, what do I do to get out of this, and where do I go, right?
Yes.
There are many recourses, there are many remedies, but we don't even get to that point because the point stops at oh, you said something, therefore we have to take action, you know. So clearly this is going to impact a lot more. I think people are going to feel a lot more afraid, which explains why a lot of the foreign workers, for example, did not go for the test, because we first promised them that no action is going to be taken, and then suddenly these things happen, the barbed wire happens, and then people go and hide. But what do you expect them to do? They are fearful, right? So the narrative becomes one of fear, of taking action. So sorry to take that long, but I think it's about thinking about what do we write about when discussing the plight or the issues. Okay, it doesn't have to be negative, but also the experiences of people who are in a disadvantaged position. So we must be very mindful for the media, and particularly for the media, to not continue pushing people in that situation, but to slowly take them out and understand why they are there and what are the issues.
I do agree. I think that the media should play to reflect what is actually the actual scenario, what is happening nowadays. I think that from what that Gayatri that you just, Dr. Gayatri also you mentioned about the beginning, I think that the risk that I think that Al Jazeera is actually taking is actually, I know they want to attract the audience attention with this kind of a gimmick, I would call it, like to create that kind of a conflict and also create that kind of a human interest, like the sensationalize it and so forth. I think that you have to understand, I think that you're actually like playing with fire. It's actually the risk that you're actually going to take as being a journalist, right? But if you are actually talking about that it's a fact that you're actually reporting the fact, reflecting the actual scenario and so forth, I think that it's okay, even though that is controversial, but you are actually should be safe. From my point of view, I think that as a journalist, you should make the judgment. I'm not saying like you must always agree with the government. I can see also certain part of the things that is actually not government is actually not doing. Everything is perfect. Everything is right. I think that as a journalist, you are also playing the role, not just only reflect what is actually the bottoms up, but also you are actually talking about as a watchtower. I think that you can actually watching on what is actually like a state of what we call the power in terms of looking at the government, the happening, and so forth. I think that there is where that we are actually coming back.
I just want to clarify. I wasn't saying that the Al Jazeera report was peddling sensationalism. I was just saying as the general. Yeah, I just wanted to clarify that. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. I think that my words, my apology. Okay. I take it like I know that you are actually described as though that they are actually talking about what they create that kind of a human interest, like attraction, I would say. Sorry, I think that I added the word of the sensational mind. Okay, my apology for that. Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Okay. I think a little bit about that. I think also Gayatri has mentioned that Al Jazeera has been quite consistent in their stories, and it's not the first time they're talking about migrant communities in Malaysia. So there's a context there. Leading up to how the stories have been built up. Okay, I think a very good one is, I want to move on to another question where also touching on what Dr. Chang has said, that we can be critical about the government. But what I have personally observed, I could be wrong, maybe both of you could correct me. Malaysia is one of the few countries that's performing quite well in containing the pandemic, and then there's a lot. Therefore, there's a lot of trust in the authorities, and also particularly for the DG personally. So I think this trust is very important in policies implementation. Rather than having us questioning the numbers every day, we actually trust the authorities. But do you think that this is a situation that we should be worried about? We should be worried about, because I'm talking about the context of what has transpired is also we have seen like a one-day sitting of Parliament during the MCO. We also see restricted access to press conferences that's taken place. So these are the things that little things that we might need to take into consideration, or should we be worried about? Maybe Dr. Chang, do you have anything to say about this? Then we will pass on to Gayatri.
Well, yeah, actually that really is a hot seat now. Okay, so I think that as a government servant, I think that I think that as an authority, and I thank Lichin that actually praising the authority has done well, especially our government servant in terms of like we talk about our DG of health and so forth. And of course, then you talk about government also, you don't forget also we are actually led by the politician, our minister and so forth. I'm not saying that all the ministers are bad and so forth, but I think sometimes that also people also having a little bit question. But having said that, what I would say, like we talk about this, the trust in the government, I would say somehow I think that the office is actually still run by us as a government servant. So we will try our best. I think that we are actually the government servant is actually we serve the public. We try to do our best for the public, and so to say. But having said that, we actually question about what we call like promise, no action against all those illegal immigrants and so forth. I do not know. I think that neither that I think that the health ministry can make such promises and so forth. I think that I saw the comment also from a medical doctor, and I think that who is actually the Mercy president. He himself also is actually a little bit fearful in terms of want to do the test for all the COVID-19 because of they know a certain action being taken is actually can fear away all the so-called illegal and undocumented person. So I think that is where sometimes that in government itself that also we are actually facing that kind of situation. That so to say that how that we juggle with all the different department and different agency, government agency, and you know that government is such a big what we call organization, and they actually got the synchronized. Yeah, so it just only because of one person, then you may accuse that the whole government is actually bad in the sense and so forth. But I would say that most of the time, we government servant is actually try our best to deliver the best to our people, I would say. And back to the question also, I think that Gayatri, that you are also saying that, I do understand, I think that we are not just talking about the citizen, we are also talking about the humankind. So I think that I do understand about this undocumented person, they are actually also as a human being in terms of what we call, they are actually just like us, except that they are actually without document. They cannot claim their so-called right in our country here because of they are not the citizen. And I think that there are also a lot of, I think that from the legal aspect, and I think that I'm not going to deliberate so much, but I think that it's back to this issue about, I would say, as a government servant, back to you, I think that let you all judge how that we deliver our service, I would say that. Okay.
Gayatri, I don't...
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I would say that actually, because this is a health crisis,
yes,
you know,
yes,
it's not
it's a public
political
health
crisis.
issues.
Well,
yeah.
Okay, Malaysia is special because we have political crisis and health crisis at the same time.
Okay.
Yes. Which probably explains also quite a lot of the gaps and the confusion, and actually the more reason why we need to ask more questions, right? Because there was, I suppose, you know, a huge uncertainty at a time like this. You have this political crisis to deal with, and I think it's justified to ask all of those questions, and in fact we should be asking more questions. I think that because Li Jing, you started talking about how, you know, in terms of dealing with the pandemic, we have had some sort of recognition in that sense, and I think Malaysian, in terms of our public health, and again, this is not something that just happened now. I think we should give credit where it's due. The Malaysian public health system has had many different recognitions in the past. We've had a history of developing, you know, sort of community base and dealing quite well in many issues. So, you know, give the credit where it's due. However, given the fact that we've had this pandemic, and the fact that it has, you know, it's a global pandemic, it's not just in some areas in Malaysia. It has so much of implications on so many levels, health, economy, you know, mental health, so many other things. But we've not been able to actually debate about them, right?
True.
We've not been able to query down to the level of, you know, specific decision making. It is actually so important to be transparent at this particular point, because people are unsure, people are uncertain. You know, there are normal concerns about, you know, many things. What's going to happen tomorrow? Am I going to have a job? I mean, all these are real concerns, and it's justified to ask all of those things. So it is actually really, I think on that level of being transparent, this government has actually failed. Yeah, the kind of back and forth, the kind of lack of clarity. I'm not targeting any specific ministries or agencies, but as a cohesive body, yes, they have failed. Certain ministries and certain agencies have done better than the others. That's true. But I think actually it's very interesting to talk about the role of the DG, because I think the sense of confidence of the DG is a reflection of the distrust of the politicians, right? And that I believe is very controversial for everyone involved. But I think, right, that generally people don't trust the government in many ways. And then so when they find someone who they think gives them a direction, then they pin on and leverage there. Yeah. And then what happens is that then you don't allow yourself to be critical of the decisions that come, right?
Yes.
Because you're holding on to someone because we don't have faith in that person, we don't have faith in this politician, which is the case, right? And so that we have seen actually some conversations going on about whether certain measures were appropriate, is adequate, but not enough debate in the public arena. Research is actually not enough, I believe, in Malaysia currently, with regards to the COVID-19, so that people who are in the know, I'm not an expert, so I will have to rely on other people who can interpret that data, but I think that data is actually insufficient. I think many other countries have done so much of research in this short period to try and understand, analyze, and see whether the measures that are being taken are actually appropriate and adequate. So that's actually missing. But it's because we're giving him so much of space, the DG in particular, because actually we don't know who else to hold on to. And that's not a good situation at all. We cannot pin our hopes on individuals, right? This is a global pandemic, and we as a nation of citizens and non-citizens are affected. Because the virus doesn't see the color, doesn't see your IC first, right?
Yes.
So I think the level of critical thinking is so important, and questioning is so important, but it's really missing. So we are unable to also maybe critique because we actually lack certain data.
True.
And I believe that is a pressure point we must keep giving, and that's where the media comes in, that's where the experts come in to get all of those. So yes, I think Li Ching, yes, good success in some ways, but I think we can do a lot more, and not to be unfair to whoever who's doing the work. I think there's so many people doing fantastic work. Really, we thank them for that. But I think as far as, is it sustainable?
Yeah.
Are our measures sustainable? Are they adequate? Are they backed up by enough evidence? I think maybe that's where some experts would disagree and say, no, we don't have enough at this point.
Yep. Good point noted. Let's move on a little bit about, press freedom in Malaysia. We talk about I mentioned just now earlier on, Malaysia did very well for our World Press Freedom Index in 2020. So I think I could be wrong, it's the best that we have achieved so far. I'm not so sure. I know it doesn't mean, I don't know, but how do you think that the recent development will affect our standing? Because I think in noting that of how we perform in 2020, it's very much because of the change of government. But we had a change again this year. We had a change again this year, and post-pandemic and all those things. How do you think, and how things are being handled now? How do you think we will fare in next year? What do you think, Gayatri?
So I was quite critical when the index came out after 2018, because to me, when because I've been involved in this work, and in fact I use the index as well, so I'll shamelessly say that I use the index too. We've never been in a great position compared to many other countries. We shouldn't be comparing ourselves to countries that actually have worse situation or bad situation, because it's not helpful. But I would look at actually things like the legal framework, whether your rights as a journalist and an editor is consistent and is protected. And in fact, even for sources. So we always look at journalists, right? And say, do you have the right? Do you have the ability to do your work as the watchdog? But we don't look at sources, people who speak to the media or who the journalists contact, because they actually have no protection, right? That's something that we tend to forget. So many of them have ended up, like in the case of the Al Jazeera report, just as an example, but also in other cases where people have given comments for stories in the media, then they get called up for investigations, right? Looking at the broader perspective in terms of who owns the media, is there actually a free space for everyone to own media? Particularly media that reaches the mass. So I'm not talking about social media. I'm talking about the kinds of mass media that you can have, and those are expensive things. So I don't think there were significant changes in terms of the laws or in terms of who owns the media. These are very big issues to me. So even the PH came in, they had a lot of promises in their manifesto. We know that the anti-fake news law was repealed, which is good. But that's actually not the biggest issue. The biggest issue is the Printing Presses Publications Act. It's so old, it really needs to go. The Communications and Multimedia Act, Sedition Act, Official Secrets Act. I mean, that's, for researchers and journalists, that's like so important, right?
Yes.
So, just to say that I didn't agree with the big jump that was awarded, because I think structurally, we didn't actually have a big difference. Because if your ability to report is determined by whether the ministers think it's okay for you to report, that's actually not freedom, right? It shouldn't matter what the ministers think. It shouldn't matter what the politicians think or the businessmen think or whoever it is. You have that protection. You have that right. You have the ability to do it within your own boundaries, ethical considerations, professional considerations, all of that. So if it's at the behest or at the discretion of the ministers, that's actually not a guarantee for you, right? So I would say that at the broad level, things did not change, even though the sentiment was that things are better. But sentiment is sentiment, but it's not backed up by actual changes. So I think that it was a very short period of feeling a little bit of relief, I think, for a lot of journalists and editors, that, okay, now at least a bit of a space, right? But you see how quickly that can reverse, because actually the foundation is the same still, unfortunately. So you have to constantly negotiate and bargain and stuff like that. So which means that actually the situation hasn't really changed in that sense. So I think moving,
I know that the legal framework that you've mentioned is still there.
It's there.
So talking, can I say something about different view from the journalist? Again, that I think I'm not representing all the layman, but I think that from a common person, like every day that watching the TV, reading your news and so forth, as a media, so-called the consumer in that sense, not the journalist. I know that for a journalist, the index is actually very important to you all, right? So I think that, yes, index, I think that it's an indicator for our freedom of expression. But from the layman point of view, I think that this freedom of expression is actually, I can say anything that I like, okay? So I think that now with the technology that is actually enable them, I think that they can. I mean, become like also what we call a user-generated content. Decide that what that you have actually post there, or neither that you have post anything that up to myself that through the social media, I can actually say anything that I like. So that is actually the expression that they have the freedom in the sense. But of course, I will say that also again, sometimes that you can be caught in terms of so-called claim to be spreading the fake news and so forth. Like it's actually a certain act, it's actually go against the person, like the user. But bear in mind, I think that also is actually to tell us also, I think that freedom of expression is actually not like freedom to tell lie as well. And also there is a danger in the sense like people also tend to ignore, I mean, the so-called the authenticity of the sources and the genuinity. I think that is that true. I think that it can cause any, I mean, what we call the social disorder in the sense like maybe can create that kind of conflict among, especially that we are actually this what we call plural society and very much like a very diversified community and so forth. So it's just the same like what you have actually watched in the sense like when this issue, I think that the all those marginalized community is actually being bombarded by the netizen. So I think that this is not right. I also condemn that kind of exploitation of so-called the media usage in the sense. But back to that, I would say freedom of expression that I know for you both as a journalist, that you look at it is actually from your point of view, but also please also consider the point of view of the media user as well. So this is where that I just would like to share my different view from both of you.
No, actually, may I add to Dr. Shamsi?
Yeah, please.
Sure.
Actually, because I think that there are two. Because people think that press freedom means the freedom to report all, but without realizing that actually the value of press freedom comes because, in fact, it's restrained a lot more because of ethical conduct, right?
Yeah.
The code of ethics and professional conduct. So, so there is. When we talk about press freedom, it's actually the freedom to be able to report without having to go to jail for what you report, or being murdered for it in some countries, being able to access public information. So that's why, we talk about the Official Secrets Act, because all of us cannot queue up at the government department and ask for information, which is why we kind of rely on the media to do that job for us, and you should be able to do that. But the threshold for public freedom of expression is actually much higher. So journalists are already constrained because they are reporting on news, right?
Yeah, it's a conduct there. It's a code of conduct.
There is actually already. So
Yes,
there is a misconception that press freedom means, I think for public, they think
freedom.
that you can report anything. Actually, it's not. For public, you're right that actually we have seen the kind of comments on netizens. But what is strange is that, when these kinds of comments go, you don't, in fact, you can use the laws which are there to protect, are not used. So, there's a bit of inconsistency, but I just wanted to make that difference that the press already has some constraints actually. And for public, the threshold ought to be higher because you're not obliged like the media. It's a personal opinion in that sense. So,
Yeah. No, I think it's good that, this broadest, because you talk about the code of ethics. I think in Malaysia per se, for the longest time ever, we have been talking about having a self-regulating body, which is the Malaysian Media Council. I mean, after PH took over the government, that's one thing that we see. It's closer to materialization of a self-regulating body, but it didn't really happen. It didn't really materialize, but I think maybe Gayatri, you could speak a little bit about it, because that's also I think a good way to explain how media could regulate themselves, that our freedom to report is not it's not absolute.
Sure. So you're right in that this discussion is going on for many years, for many decades. Some of them we've been talking about.
When I was an undergraduate student then, 30 years back.
It's a long so the idea is that it should not be the state that defines what you can report and what you cannot report, because it's not an independent position, right? Because they always have their interest. So the idea is that the industry, civil society, and over the years, civil society more involved in this process, that you have a code, you enforce the code among your own members in your own industry. Actually, it already exists with so many, right? You look at the medical profession, advertising, there's already a code in that sense. But the media, news media in particular, is very, very closely tied to politics in this country, party politics and so many things. So I think the point of even forming this pro-tem committee for the Media Council is probably one of the major steps for the media to come together, because I think the reality in Malaysia is that the media is disunited because everyone has their own interests, either it's business, affiliations, and that is the reality that the media, or at least the larger ones and the older ones, have carved out their positions, and so it's not in their interest to actually, come together. To be honest, so this is actually the first time, and the idea is that you remove the legislations that give the state the control over what you can do and what you cannot do.
Yes.
But let the industry self-regulate, with the idea that, look, you're also kind of serving the public. Of course, you have your business agenda. That's fine. Make your money, no problem. But that you can correct yourself in the process where there's a mistake, where there's inaccuracy, and also don't have to, get this kind of mega defamation suits that we've seen in the past.
Yes.
So this provides an avenue for the public also to say, hey, I think you've been unethical, right? In some reporting, okay. Or in some cases where I think you've tarnished my reputation. So it gives you an opportunity to go there before the kind of big defamation suits, which I'm sure the media would appreciate, actually, right?
Yes.
So But you're right to say that, well, what happens now? Because it was only formed this year and before the transition, the second transition. So we, as the committee, we actually continued doing the work and we had done some consultations, not enough because MCO happened.
Yes.
And so we are hoping to finalize the report. I wouldn't, we do have a whole committee, but we did continue trying to think about, getting inputs from the editors and journalists on what the code of ethics are, what the mechanism ought to be. So the work continued. And I think the question is now whether the government is actually interested to pursue with what was already put in place. And also for the media to say, look, we really want it and we need to push for it.
Yeah, I think also for the benefit of the audience, this is not like,
Sure.
this is not only in Malaysia, this is something, even Indonesia has it as early
They
as
have a pretty good one. Yeah.
early 2000s. So maybe this is a very good direction that we can move towards, where we can have like self-regulated media which can, serve like ethical news or produce quality good news for the public at large.
Yeah. I'm sure you don't want any more letters or show cause letters from...
show cause letters. Yes. All these letters actually, we talk about, it move on to like self-censorship, whether in the media. And because if you talk about even in like, I think the recent development pursuant to the Al Jazeera video, we talk about having social media content creator also to apply for license. That got people very worried also. Not only the cost.
I can't do my TikTok anymore.
You can't just wake up and want to do something.
So like we have to apply for permit now. So.
Sorry, exactly. Even this, right?
even this. But I think I also wanted to touch on Dr. Chang talk about fake news, talk about law using. Talk about law on how to tackle fake news. It's fake news is real. We cannot deny its existence. But I would really like to discuss, because the Home Minister recently just said that we need Sedition Act. This very, very antiquated act, we need it because of fake news. Certainly it has a new reason to exist, fresh reasons to exist. But I don't know because I think maybe we have some other alternative out there to tackle fake news. I don't know, maybe I can throw this to Gayatri, or you can share some of your thoughts about it. My position is this. I think that fake news has become an anything. I think if you go to the laws that we have now, it recognizes, and in fact it's not unusual regarding false information, because you can use that for fraud, for deception. There can be information that's put out there with the intent to deceive, right, and to cause fraud, or in some cases information that's put out that eventually harm someone's reputation, which is why you have the Defamation Act. So there is in fact a kind of a reason, justifiable, why putting out false information is actually harmful. Again, you need to show where the harm is. So actually, if you look at a lot of the content outside of COVID but maybe even including during the COVID period, but outside of the COVID, a lot of what was peddled out as fake news from the state, from the government, was actually fraud. The Macau scam, banking, don't give your bank details. You see, all those are scams, which in fact already, which is a crime, and the laws already exist in terms of advertising law, Computer Act, cybercrime. So they're there, even consumers. So if you're cheated because someone made you put in some money because you're supposed to buy something, the Consumer Protection Act actually covers that, right? Yes.
But that's not fake news, that's a scam.
Yes.
That's what it is. It's a scam, it's a fraud. And then you have the other end, which is a deliberate attempt by some groups of people to highlight certain issues, which may or may not be false, because a lot of it is opinion-based. So you can't even say that it's necessarily false. It's like a perception, or I heard this, I'm worried about this. So that's actually not even false. It's a sense of you're creating doubts over something. And this is what happened in the... I would say yes. That is what we need to maybe look at. And if you studied it, I suppose, given what we have seen in the US campaign, the European campaign, in Philippines,
Yes.
it's actually very organized. So to deal with that, it's in fact a lot more political. That's actually a political issue. So having a law is, I don't even think it's going to tackle, because when the government speaks about it, when you talk about the minister, for example, they don't want to address the source of the issue. Because when you start addressing the source of the issue, it comes back to politics. It comes back to the divisions in society. It comes back to using religion, ethnicity to whip up emotions. That has nothing to do with fake news, actually. That's a campaign, that's propaganda that uses social media and stuff like that. So my view is that the whatever laws that come about fake news is actually really, really bad. We should reject it. To use that and say that's why we need sedition is in fact even worse.
Yes.
Because we want to narrow or get rid of sedition, not expand its use. Because I think a lot of what they say is problematic. We can actually look at it in the penal code and say maybe we need to amend it to include that. If we don't recognize disinformation and disinformation that is actually political, then actually all the others, it just becomes, I think, a tool maybe to silence people, critics. So I would say, no to fake news laws in that sense, because it is not going to deal with what I think is actually the problem that we have, which is the disinformation, and that requires a very different kind of intervention.
I think Dr. Chang, do you have anything to add?
I have a slightly different thinking about this, so to say, about this. I know that it's a freedom of expression, and I think we talk about the terminology of this fake news. It can be like maybe scam or whatever that you call it. But back to the one that I want to say, if the disinformation is with intent, and with the what we call, especially for us in public relations, that we may face sometime for the organization to have this information crisis, and people tarnishing you with this kind of so-called information is actually, and it's not true, and we kind of fabricate with a lot of all the fraud and whatever, I mean, said to make the public perception. We all know about this in terms of public opinion. I think that we all study about this Walter Lippmann exactly 100 years ago. So he's talking about the world outside and the picture in our head. So that how that is actually register something in our mind is actually can go through all the information that it can be true and it can be false news and so to say. And in that sense, I find that we need to have certain things to regulate and not like allowing the information just be freely flow to the public and without that kind of or either that you can say that maybe the media council can be one of the alternatives. It can be a machinery to regulate and so to say. My point is actually that it's not like total in the sense that it's out of control, and that can create that kind of anarchy, I would say, the chaotic kind of a society. So.
Well, but we do have actually. So if, for example, when you talk about reputation, then it would be defamation. So you deal with it from civil defamation rather than criminal, because that would be problematic, I think. But if you talk about, for example, something that could lead to harming individuals because of their identity, and that is very important, that's already criminal. And in fact, you have that also already in the penal code. Yeah. So it's not that. I think the point is to say what is the harm that is resulting from this particular kind of content, and if politicians, for example, also peddle a lot of this, and I would say that make it as part of the elections offences, that you cannot use someone's race, identity, ethnicity, religion in order to gain that kind of vote. So you cannot racialize, for example, issues as part of your vote buying, because that would be something that you intentionally want to whip up that sentiment. So you place it where it's relevant to the harm, I suppose, in that sense.
Yeah.
So Dr. Chang, you're right. It's not that I said there's no harm, but I think we need to identify where the harm is, and then see maybe it exists already in our current legislation.
Yeah, I agree with you.
Yeah.
Okay. I think that's the part about the legal framework. We have touched almost a lot on it. But also I think earlier on Dr. Chang talked about him as a media consumer. I think today we live in a very interesting world as a media consumer. Very interesting world. And it's very much decided by the algorithm of big tech platforms. We all know that, and we cannot deny that. You search something, Google tell you what you can see and what you can't see. You go on your Facebook, what your friends and families are sharing is actually much more important than what, any pressing current issues that's happening and you have to know. Okay, so I don't know, like how do you both think that, what are the roles of news media to actually fulfill our obligation of keeping our audience informed? How should we do that? And anything, maybe something is different reporting today and reporting like before the time of Facebook or before the time of Google. Gayatri, do you want to start?
I suppose that, the difference, as you said now, is that people have more options. So they think they can source independently, which is a good thing because, if you can do things yourself, you can find information yourself. That's actually good. You have more options. But I do think that at some point, people will need the kind of informed content,
Yes.
right? It's unfortunate that I suppose for most users, the majority of the content that they look for, and we've seen the statistics quite a lot, primarily would be for entertainment and for online shopping. If you look at online behavior. So news is not necessarily at the top in terms of the first thing they look at. So you're competing a lot with other kinds of entertainment. But to me, it doesn't mean that it completely replaces or, that news is not important. Because I actually think a lot of what people talk about, which ends up being kind of gossip and modified and manipulated, starts with news, right? So a lot of conversation starts with actually the news. It's like the olden days, you say maybe at Kedai Mama or drinking tea, you talk about it. So now it moves on to the personal communication space and social media. So I think there is still a lot of value. And at some point, especially with media literacy, if we can get that going, tell people, look, how do you verify information? How do you trust this information? Is it true or not? Then you will want people to say, okay, where did you get it from? Okay, if it's a known media, there's some kind of credibility, then you can say at least it's true from based on that. So I think there's still value. And I think the more people, I think that behavior with the social media will kind of plateau because you also see different behavior. Like with age groups, use the social media differently, right? So there will come a point where, people will actually want the kind of verified information because so many things are happening in their lives. They will want to confirm something. Where do you go to, right? So, but it's the reality is news media has to compete with all of the other sources of information. And then you have financial sustainability issue as well because a lot of ads are being taken away. So it's a real problem. But I think maybe innovation is really important to find how you can tap into what people are doing in terms of their online usage. I think maybe you need to invest a little bit in that to see how to bridge that gap maybe. User engagement, if that's accepted. But I think that maybe understanding that relationship, we are in a process where a lot of people also don't understand their relationship with their device,
Yes, that's right.
So, maybe it's good if we can help people think through those things and let them make the decision. But I think there is a lot of value, as I said much earlier, that there's something that differentiates news media from the others. And it's the ability of the journalists and the editors to be able to get and crunch information that I cannot do on my own. You must give the audiences something to be able to understand issues, maybe think critically, because they're also going to look at other sources. And then they're going to say, oh, since you said this, oh, Star said that, or the Harvard said this, wow, they Googled Harvard and got something. So you have to be at par with some of these things as well, right? Yeah, but media literacy is really one of the starting points.
I think that's really what's absent from our school syllabus, which we should start really, really early. Not only when you do it in university and you talk about how to differentiate what is fair reporting, what is not, and stuff like that. So maybe Dr. Chung, do you have anything to add on in terms of?
I when we talk about this news media, I think that my old school, I think that 30 years back, I think that is already, I think that not applicable now. So we still talk about the mass media and the mass communication and the mass society. I think that these are all the old school, I would say. So new medias nowadays, I think that ever since, I think that we all of us are having this smartphone since 2007, and things for this past 10 years, I think that they has developed so much into this media organization that they have to relook about their product. I think that they cannot do it in the traditional manner. So I think that of course, towards the end, news is still a news. That I think the content is actually the king, I would say. So that is where we will say that with so much missed choices for the consumer, and then also so diversified the audience, I think that you can never talk about mass communication or mass audience, so to say. You can only talk about, I call it as like, maybe I have seen somewhere that you say mass customization. You have to customize to the needs. I think that your content is actually to suit their personality, to suit their needs, and to gratify them according to what that they are actually looking for. So I think that is where that we are also talking about. In that sense, is actually we also have to talk about in terms of survival, and of course, I think that the number of the audience or the so-called viewer will tend to reduce. So in what way that you're actually going to make your money from them? I think that is actually another aspect. I think that for the media organization to survive, you need to have a critical mass in terms of the number of the what we call the consumer that willing to engage with you and continue to sustain with you and grow with you. And you have to also talking about how about the relationship. And this is where that I think that maybe public relations is actually playing another important role. Let me check a little bit about my profession, so that you need to have that as well. I think that it's not just solely like what we talk about, the one-way communication. So we can see nowadays that why that you have this user-generated content, and I think that much more to say. I think that you should allow the audience to have that kind of what we call the autonomy. I think that to like what Dr. Gayatri was talking about. They have various sources. They can compare notes. Once that they find that you are actually outdated, and then they may just abandon you. They may go for another one. I think that the life cycle is just very fast if you don't maintain it well.
It's interesting that both of you mentioned about they have various options out there, but many times these options might be the same. They might be in the same bubble. They might contain themselves in the same bubble. I think this is also another very pressing issues for media consumption nowadays. I think Gayatri mentioned a very good point about media literacy. We can teach that in school, but maybe our audience also need to know that they have to try to look a little bit at different sources of news. Something that they don't like it, maybe they should also refer to it. That's what I do. I think that I can challenge the algorithm and be a little bit I don't know. That's what I practice. That's what I practice. I
just joke a little bit about media literacy. I know that all of us, I think that as an educator, we always try to champion, I think that try to propagate to have this media literacy. So media literacy is actually to some extent that it's not like how that you know how to use the devices, the gadget. So it's actually more about the content, that how you consume the meaning of it. I think that sometimes I think that it's just joke. I think that because when I conduct a kind of simple research, find among all the youngsters talking about why about using this gadget, and then they give me a 3 word: simple, attractive, and fun. So this is what they find that is actually their knowledge about the media. I think that they find it that way. So I always look at it that it's actually S-A-F. What about the E? Education. We find it safe to use that gadget. So that is why you lose out the education part of it. So this is just a joke about they want to talk about engaging with the young people when they talk about this media literacy. It's not just only the technical know how to use it, but it's actually about the knowledge and also the wisdom about using it for the goodness of the society, I would say.
Yeah.
I think actually part of the breaking the bubble, I think, is that also realizing actually in families and in groups there are intergenerational differences also, and I think we should give some space also, because I think that because like a lot of the younger people, like what they want, I think they also bring different things within their families to look at content differently. So again, I don't want to feel so pessimistic about how this is going to be a challenge, because for a lot of people, having to rely on what your friends and your communities are sending on WhatsApp, which is actually one of our major problems, to me is actually not about the fact that there's so much of information out and you're just in a bubble. It's because actually you're very unsure about a lot of things, and that certainty you had about your choices, politics or economy, business, whatever actually people have a lot of frustrations and a sense of, I'm not sure what it's going to be like next week, next month, next year. And I think we need to understand that a lot of the behavior comes from actually feeling quite lost in a way. And I don't want to make it as though like people are, don't know what to do, but there's actually a lot of challenges that people are facing. And then you hold on to your device because that's where maybe you're getting some comfort, whether it's from your family or your friends. So, I know actually we make a lot of jokes, right, about the older generation, younger generation and all that. But to me, what it represents is that we maybe need to understand better what are some of the sources of that. And it's okay if you're having a different political view. And I think really we should accept that people will have different political views. Don't always want to have people agree with everything and come to your side all the time. Sometimes it's okay, but sometimes just leave it.
Yeah.
It's okay. It's okay to have different political views, but you shouldn't go to jail for your political views,
True,
right?
true.
But I think that understanding that obsession with what you are getting on that WhatsApp may actually be an indicator that maybe you're actually frustrated about something, and that is your comfort. So I think a lot of us maybe need to do a much more understanding of all of these relationship with information before we say, you need to do this, you need to do that. People don't need to be told what to do. I think they're quite tired of that. But at least we can help them understand why is it that they're going through all of this process. And I feel like I'm sounding like a psychologist, but I think a lot of us go through a lot of turmoil with information. I think information is causing a lot of our turmoil, but we forget that actually there are real issues in the sense of our politics and business. So I think the literacy, just coming back to the media literacy, I think understanding the different generations, the fact that they interact, and maybe that can bring about some different ways, but then we need to understand what is the impact of some of these things and what it reflects in our real in our daily lives. I won't say real, but our daily lives.
Yeah. Oh, okay. And I mean, a good hour has passed since we started this discussion. Wow, time flies. I think we have touched on a lot of things, and I think just now, I think a very critical point that Gayatri has mentioned and Dr. Chang has mentioned, a lot of media organization, especially news media organization, is actually facing existential threat, financial crisis or challenges. Like a big chunk of what has been supporting news gathering activities has actually been taken away. It has been disrupted. Under such against such backdrop, of course, we have as not only in Malaysia but in a lot other part of the world, that we have news media organization that are facing assault, threats from powers that be. So what words would you have for the public at large? What can they do for news media organization, and why do they have to do so? Dr. Chang, do you have something?
Well, talking about the audience, I don't really get how to talk about the representing the audience about the present scenario. I really have no answer to that. And I think that it's just a matter of, I think that the audience now actually has so much choices. I think sometimes also they are actually with the flux of information. we are actually, I look at it, it's actually more like a chaotic kind of a scenario. I'm not saying that I'm being pessimistic, but understanding this, the present scenario of the communication with this device, especially this online media. So I think that our style, our lifestyle is actually changed, and I think that as for me, like a baby boomer, frankly speaking, I'm still dealing with this problem. I don't know. I have no answer. Maybe Gayatri, that you can help me. I need help for that aspect.
No, I actually think that this is one of the questions that's the toughest to explain, right? Because I think as far as our role also has changed over the years. You know, there was a time where subscribers were so important for newspapers, and then after that, for newspapers was 1-2% because the bulk of it came from advertising. And then came sponsorship and stuff like that. So then suddenly, you know, because I've been in the newsroom where editors have said, as though the subscribers are paying your salary, it's the advertisers, right? So
I don't think so. It's the advertiser that pay your salary.
Yeah, exactly.
I was from the organization before. I know that we pay for your salary.
Exactly. So, you know, we've gone through that, and now the user is getting it from not even you directly as the media, but through all these third-party platforms. Right?
Aggregate.
And now there's a struggle between the media companies and the tech companies to say, hey, actually we should get a cut out of whatever you're getting. So that's an ongoing debate, which I think must continue. And I think these big tech companies are holding too much. That monopoly has to break. And I really think that they need to confront the fact that they are affecting media in local situations. And this is a topic that we talked about like 30 years ago, I think, when it came to media conglomerates, big media, Disney and whatever.
But you think that they will easily let go? I think that they will defend that.
But I think this is where, you know, I think as users, again, media companies will have to have a strategy, whether you want to work with them or you want to fight them, right? The option's yours. But as user, we need to understand also that, hey, I may not be paying for the Facebook, but somebody's paying and telling me what I should look at. So actually, in a way, I'm kind of paying, you know, in a way. And I think we have come to a situation where we think whatever is online must be free, just because we can access it. And that also has to stop, because for journalists to continue working, they also need their salaries. Who's going to pay their salaries?
I'm sorry to say that not at this time. I think that
I'm not saying that that's an easy option. But it's also about this
education.
The E part of it, right? the myth that everything online is free, as though it just appeared out of nowhere. Somebody's working on it anyway. So it takes that mindset shift, which is very difficult. So I think at the media level, maybe the media companies need to come together in each country and say, okay, what is it that we want? Digital tax, certain kind of advertising tax, whatever, something, you know, that goes back to news production or something like that. From the user, I think we should not expect everything to be free, but not that we should, I'm not saying that we should block our access, but to understand that, look, when there is something, there's a certain cost to it as well. And we shouldn't say, oh, you are not free, so I'm going to take a, you know, third party, fourth party, like that. There has to be a way, and it does come with education.
I think that this will also take time also. I'm not sure whether within these 3-4 years, I don't think so. Even 10 years later.
No, I think it needs a generation.
It's very interesting, you know, Gayatri, because the discussion, you know, when you were in newsroom, you talk about subscriber or advertising model, and now we're talking about going back to readers' revenue, where we start to try to think of a way to get them to pay for the news gathering activities.
So it's like a cycle, circle.
It's a cycle. We are back to it again. Never mind.
So then you need to come to the PR and see they look for advertising.
To
the organization.
now we have to know how to market our news brand so that we can get more subscription online and stuff like that. So this is something that's ongoing within the news industry. But I think yeah, you guys are driving to the point that I want to drive. Yes, we need to pay for good journalism.
I'm an advocate for that.
Good journalism.
It's tough. But yeah,
I think it's all tied up together. The kind of information you get, the freedom to express yourself, the freedom to the rights to information, how it's being satisfied. You know, all these are tied up all together. It's part and parcel of the whole ecosystem. So I think this is a very good note for us to end our discussion today. Thank you so much, Dr. Chang and Gayatri. It has been very fun, very interesting. Hope you both enjoy it.
Yeah, really, we enjoy it.
It's a very interesting conversation. I'm so pleased to be here on this panel.
Yeah, and also very nice meeting you, Dr. Gayatri, in this platform. And of course, Lichin, hope to meet you again in person soon.
Yes, hope to meet you all in person soon. Okay, hi. Okay, thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us today at the panel, at the discussion. I think we have touched on a lot of things. We might not have a conclusion to whatever that has transpired, or you might have a thought or your view. But I think it is a good point for us to start thinking about the space that we have to express ourselves or to rights to information within this country and how we want to move on. So long till we meet again. Good night.